the importance of vitamin D in supporting the immune system has been known for a long time, and it's quite well accepted. It's well enough accepted even that there are authorized health claims in the European Union regarding vitamin D support for the immune system. When you look at this from a clinical perspective, people who have inadequate status of vitamin D are prone to increased rates of certain types of infections, including respiratory tract infections. And conversely, the data are very clear that people who supplement with vitamin D have a decreased incidence of respiratory tract infections. So the data around vitamin D supporting immunity are very solid. Now, what's new is in the last couple of years, we're starting to see and have seen a large and compelling body of evidence being formed that indicate that vitamin D is also important with respect to COVID-19. There are many studies that show that vitamin D inadequacy or vitamin D deficiency increases the risk for COVID and severe outcomes. For example, in late last year, there was a meta-analysis published of more than 50 observational clinical trials that showed that vitamin D inadequacy or vitamin D deficiency was associated with increased rates of COVID infection, increased rates of severe COVID infection, and increased rates of mortality from COVID-19. Furthermore, a number of studies have come out recently that suggest that supplementation with vitamin D or supplementation with the 25-hydroxy vitamin D3 form of vitamin D called calcifediol may result in reduced risk of COVID-19. For example, there was a study that was published last year in Spain, a retrospective study that looked at hundreds of thousands of individuals who were supplementing with either vitamin D3 or with calcifediol. Those who were supplementing and achieved an adequate vitamin D status had substantial and statistically significant reductions in the incidence of COVID, the incidence of severe COVID, and mortality from COVID. The other topic in the white paper looks at the relationship between vitamin D status and the immune response to vaccination. One would predict that if vitamin D is important for the immune response to an infection, which it is, you would also imagine that vitamin D is important for the response to vaccination. Vaccination is, after all, just a special way to induce an immune response. And the way it does this is very similar to the way a real infection induces an immune response. And in fact, the data are emerging to show or to indicate that vitamin D status is in fact likely quite important for immune responses to vaccination as well. One example, there was a meta-analysis of about 10 clinical studies that was published recently that looked at the relationship between vitamin D status and the response to the influenza vaccine. And what this study showed was that people who were deficient in vitamin D did not respond as well to vaccination as people who were adequate for vitamin D. More specifically, if they looked at 2 of the 3 influenza strains in the vaccine, people who are vitamin D deficient were about 33% more likely to fail to make a protective antibody response to the vaccination, which would leave those people more susceptible to illness. The new science reinforces and extends what we've come to already know about the importance of vitamin D and immunity. The emerging data with respect to vitamin D and COVID-19 is very consistent with what has already been established with respect to vitamin D and respiratory infections, for example. And the emerging data on the importance of vitamin D and vaccination is entirely consistent with that, as well as just our knowledge about vitamin D and immunity in general. And what these data do is they help us to advocate for an important way to shape and even potentially improve public health. And it shows us the importance of educating the consumer, of educating doctors and other healthcare providers, of educating people in the public health space about the importance of maintaining a sufficient vitamin D status in order to help people to support their immune systems, particularly in times like these. Let me start by reminding people that there are multiple forms of vitamin D. Most people are familiar with vitamin D3, vitamin D2, but many people are not familiar with calcifediol. Calcifediol is also known as 25-hydroxy vitamin D3. Calcifediol is naturally present in certain foods. It's naturally present in human breast milk even, so it's already a part of our diet. It's also the predominant form of vitamin D in our bloodstream. That's because as we ingest vitamin D3, either through foods or through dietary supplements, or as we synthesize vitamin D3 in our skin in response to sunlight, that vitamin D3 is converted in the liver to calcifediol, which then goes into the blood. So when you go to the doctor to have your vitamin D levels checked, they're actually measuring your blood levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D. Now, we've discussed in this interview the importance of vitamin D with respect to immune health. People understand that vitamin D is important for bone health. It's important for many aspects of human health. Unfortunately, the data show that worldwide, most people likely are inadequate or even deficient for vitamin D status. They don't have enough vitamin D in their system. So what can they do about that? There's a number of things that people can do. Supplementation with traditional forms of vitamin D, like vitamin D3, are a safe and effective way to raise vitamin D levels in the blood, to raise vitamin D status. However, going from deficiency to sufficiency, supplementing with these more traditional forms of vitamin D can take a long time. The clinical literature indicates, for example, that elderly people who are deficient, taking recommended levels of vitamin D3, it can take weeks or even a few months to optimize their status. The real advantage of calcifediol is that it's more effective at raising vitamin D status than vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. Calcifediol, in fact, has been shown in the literature to be about 3 times as effective at raising blood levels of 25-hydroxy vitamin D. It's also faster, reducing the time needed from going from deficiency to sufficiency from up to months to perhaps days or just a few weeks. And finally, it's more reliable. The clinical data also show that at recommended levels of intake, more people will achieve vitamin D sufficiency with calcifediol than with vitamin D3. So vitamin D's role in immunity is well recognized in the nutrition community, but probably less so in the medical community. What we are increasingly seeing, though, is the publication of vitamin D and immunity results, vitamin D and infection results in more medically targeted journals. And the paper in Vaccines is a continuation of that trend. It is co-authored by both MD and PhD authors and published in a journal that's relevant for immunologists, for vaccinologists, and for clinicians. It's important for articles such as these to be published to serve as catalysts for discussions in the medical community and in the public health sphere regarding the importance of vitamin D and other micronutrients to support immune function and as a way to further public health. And I would just like to add, it's really encouraging and gratifying to work for a company like DSM, who is eager to engage in these types of conversations to help improve public health and to educate consumers how they can take steps to help keep themselves healthy. There's a clear demand for nutritional products and solutions that address immune health, especially since the scientific research on how micronutrients, including vitamin D, can support immune function has evolved so quickly. And creating science-backed immunity products takes more than ingredients, it takes a partner. DSM Scientific Services, backed by our portfolio of products, customized solutions, and expert services, help our customers transform the latest science into purpose-led dietary supplement products. From helping translate complex science into consumer-focused messaging, to understanding the ever-changing regulatory landscape, DSM provides end-to-end support at every stage of product development so you can deliver immunity-focused vitamin D products that consumers will love.